wonder how many of us here today are sighing with relief. It's over. The excess of our celebrations is packed away or in process of being done so. The leftovers are being slowly whittled down, and eating a carrot stick is a refreshing change of pace. Most of us love celebrations, births and weddings, birthdays, Christmas, Easter, so we know the feeling of jubilance once they are underway. We're thrilled that which we were waiting for, that which we hoped for, is now happening. Last summer, our daughter married, and we hosted 90 people in our yard. As the day approached, the anticipation increased until on that day, we gathered on a beach to witness the bride and groom enter into a covenant of promises to keep to one another, of living a life of love and caring for one another, and any others that come into their lives, in all the ordinary days that would be ahead of them. Hope and joy were palpable in the air. And in the days after, as we removed twinkle lights from the trees, returned all we had borrowed and rented, packed it all away, for many of us, that celebration was done and behind us. Our days returned to their normal ordinariness. But for the couple, now entering into what this covenant lived out actually requires of them, they have to be continually reminded of those promises, even and especially when life is disrupted by the things that disrupt human life. There is no resting on the celebration without fulfilling the covenant of what they've been called to and committed to as they walk out their new life together. This season we've just been celebrating is like that. It's easy for us, once it's all packed away and behind us, just to rest in our ordinary lives, often sighing with relief. Yet, the very celebration itself reminds us not only of the hope of what is to come, but also of the hope that has come. The hope that disrupting our everyday lives by calling us back to the joy of being co-laborers with God in his redeeming, reconciling, restoration work of bringing all things in heaven and earth together under one head, even Christ. Today, in our passage from the prophet Isaiah, that exuberance and joy of hope in the air drifts off the page. We're going to pick up at Isaiah chapter 61, verse 10, and go through to 62:3. I delight greatly in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God. For he has clothed me with garments of salvation and arrayed me in robes of righteousness, as a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. For as the soil makes the sprout come up, and a garden causes seed to grow, so the sovereign Lord will make righteousness and praise spring up before all nations. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not remain quiet, till her righteousness shines out like the dawn, her salvation like a blazing torch. The nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory. You will be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will bestow. You will be a crown of splendor in the Lord's hand, a royal diadem in the hand of your God. It's no wonder Isaiah is celebrating. Look at what has occurred prior to his great praise and delight. Heavenly promises have come to earth. Prophecies of old and long yearned for are being unfolded. Hope is heavy in the air. Verse 10 gives us the imagery of exactly what occurs at a wedding. The bride is dressed and presented to the groom. A covenant is enacted, and then it's time to party. Hope is heavy in the air. So heavy, so tangible, that Isaiah says he can't keep silent for the sake of Zion, for the sake of the people. He can't stay quiet because this message, This message of the one who will come like a blazing torch amongst them is now revealed. In the same way, we shouldn't keep silent for the sake of the world that God so loves and to whom he commands us to love as he loves. God with us has put on flesh, incarnated himself, and salvation has come down like that blazing torch, with righteousness and justice shining out like the dawn. And for this, we cannot keep quiet. Or can we? After we've sang the familiar and favorite songs, retold the wondrous stories, cleaned up the party messes, and packed it all away for another year, do we also somehow inadvertently pack away or put on the back burner the full message of the good news, the gospel that is now here on earth as it is in heaven, and which Isaiah expresses in this prophecy, leading to his great delight and joy? As we look at this passage, it is clear that celebration is in order. But what is it that is being celebrated? Birth of the Messiah isn't mentioned here at all. Although for the Messiah to exist, a birth certainly occurred. Rather, the passage tells us that what is being celebrated so extravagantly is the clothing of the people by God with garments of salvation and with being arrayed in robes of righteousness. That the people are now called oaks of righteousness for the display of God's splendor. That as we wear these clothes displaying the character of God, we will shine out like the dawn, like blazing torches, and that in acting and enlivening God's gracious righteousness and justice brings him splendor, right into the crown of his hand. Some 700 years later, when Jesus begins his active ministry on earth, he refers to this prophecy in Luke 4. This is no passing reference, but rather the foundation of what God, incarnated, is ushering into the human reality. Salvation is good news to the poor, the disenfranchised, the brokenhearted, the captives, prisoners of darkness. This good news of bringing his justice that delivers people out of shame and rejection and back into the community of humans to God and humans to one another. The good news of God establishing his kingdom as the rule and reign of earth and heaven. The good news of redeeming humans back into his shalom, rising humans out of the ashes and crowning them with it as his image bearers to shine like the dawn among all the peoples with righteousness and justice of God's desire, that all his creation is reconciled and restored to him and to community relationships again. Of restoring that which has been distorted by humanity's desire to be gods of their own selves and lives. Of being crowns of splendor in the hand of the Lord and oaks of righteousness for the display of God's splendor. This is the good news of being invited to participate with God in rebuilding and restoring the places long devastated, where hope has been disrupted by the cruelty, oppression, pain, and death of humans living life as our own gods. This, and so much more, is what Isaiah's words are delighting in and celebrating. It is clear that God's salvation action is for the peace and justice in our neighborhoods, cities, and the world. Shalom, complete wholeness, healing and restoring of all things, both now and into our forever. And as his people, set free from sin and fear of death that incites every man for himself mentality, as God's people wear these clothes of salvation and righteousness and justice, we display God's splendor. But what does that mean? What is God's splendor? What is his splendor but his character? His splendor is for the display of his character through this salvation that has entered into human history. Jesus, in John 17, while talking to his Father, says he has brought God glory on earth by completing the work he gave him to do. And then he says, "And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began." And then, even further, he says, "I have given them, us, all believers, the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one." What is this glory? Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible notes that in the New Testament, just as in the Old, glory refers to salvation now, revealed in the Messiah's work of deliverance. Thus, John presents Jesus as the revelation of God's glory, his works as the sign of that same glory. Participation in the glory of the resurrected Christ is participation in the glory of God. Believers are the image and glory of God, giving glory by leading lives worthy of the gospel through obedience, good deeds, purity, and willingness to suffer for Christ. We see this also in the Psalms so many times. God's glory rests in his mighty works manifested in creation itself, the psalmist writes. At the announcement of Jesus' birth, the angels declare, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to all people on whom his favor rests." When we go back to what is God's splendor, not only here in our Isaiah passage, but in many other references, we remember that God's splendor is the display of his character through salvation that has entered human history. These words, splendor and glory, are often interchangeable, as they are communicating a similar aspect of God and his character and his relationship with humans. God's splendor, his glory, is displayed through his image bearers as we enact and enliven his salvation of righteousness and justice in the true Hebrew understanding of justice, tzedakah, that kind of justice that delivers from slavery and oppression and restores people to community relationships. And then that righteousness, misfat, is displayed when we are the deliverers of justice that restores community relationships, including our relationships with God. No wonder Isaiah is delighting greatly in the Lord rejoicing. God is adorning. He's clothing us with clothes of righteousness and justice that bring shalom to the world. And we, as these image bearers of God, shine in the world. And as we do, we become crowns of splendor in God's hand. We have displayed God's character, just as Jesus in John 17 rejoices in, and exactly as Isaiah foretold in the beginning of this chapter 61 prophecy, and of which Jesus announced his intentions at the outset of his ministry in Luke 4. It is not necessarily our ritual acts of worship that bring God glory, yet part of giving God glory comes from our honor of him. But it's also our obedience and allegiance to display God's salvation plan of redemption, reconciliation, and restoration to all those to whom God has been inaccessible and to whom the world is neglected, repressed, oppressed, and trampled upon. How then can we keep silent? How then can we pack up our celebratory decorations and simply go back to our regular days of ordinary living? God, through Christ and his work, has co-opted us to join his great good news of his kingdom here on earth, working towards his understanding of righteousness and justice. Isaiah eloquently pours it out for us to bind up the brokenhearted, proclaiming freedom to whatever holds people captive, releasing humans from prisons of their own devices and the devices of others, to comfort all who mourn and grieve, to pour upon our heads gladness instead of ashes, clothing us with the liberty from these things, so we rise up from what Isaiah tells us God calls us in chapter 130, oaks with fading leaves, to what Isaiah now says in 61:3, to being oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for his splendor. Tim Keller has written, "The gospel is not just about individual happiness and fulfillment. It's not just a wonderful plan for my life, but a wonderful plan for the world. It is about the coming of God's kingdom to renew everything. Gospel-centered churches do not only urge individuals to be converted, but also to seek peace and justice in our cities and in our world. God calls us to reorient our lives around mercy and justice, around being healers of the world. Jesus describes his followers as light of the world, and that our participating in acts of righteousness that delivers the kind of justice that restores reveals our God who loves the world. So much so, he sent Jesus to usher in his kingdom, where peace and justice and healing and completeness prevail. Shalom. Rather than packing everything away at the end of the celebration, this is the time to intentionally pursue God with all our hearts, minds, souls, and strength, so that we are clothed in his righteous acts of delivering the kind of justice that restores those community relationships, advocating justice for all peoples in all ways, in loving neighbors as we desire to love ourselves and to be loved. As we enact, wear our clothes of his mighty love, compassion, mercy, justice, and grace, we shine, not from our own light, but from the light of the world, and we display God's splendor wherever we live, work, play, and pray. This is what brings God glory.